I am George Washington, a soldier, a planter. I gave birth to a new nation. My journey was not one of preordained glory, but of constant, hard-won choices. They offered me a crown, I gave them a republic. This is my story.
He was born not amidst the fanfare of an empire, nor under the shadow of a legacy universally admired, but in the quiet expanse of Virginia's fertile countryside on February 22nd, 1732. A slender, restless boy, George Washington entered a world defined by tobacco plantations, sprawling forests, and the rhythms of colonial life along the Potomac River. His home, Pope's Creek, a modest plantation managed by his father Augustine Washington, was imbued with the scent of fresh soil, the smoke of hearth fires, and the distant murmurs of slaves and laborers who sustained the household. George's earliest memories were not of grandeur, but of space, labor, and observation, learning the weight of responsibility long before he understood its implications. Childhood for George was both formative and constrained. His father died when he was only 11, leaving a void filled by older siblings, guardians, and the expectations of a society where inheritance, land, and social stature defined one's future. Young George grew keenly aware of hierarchy, duty, and the subtle negotiations of human behavior. He was educated in the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but much of his learning came from the land itself, the management of estates, the measurement of fields, and the observation of nature's unforgiving cycles. These lessons, practical and immediate, would later underpin the strategic patience and resourcefulness that became his hallmark. Washington's adolescence was shaped by a duality, a longing for independence and an instinctive respect for authority. At 15, he inherited responsibility for surveying the frontier lands of Virginia. He walked endless miles of dense forests, charting rivers and mountains, noting the contours of wilderness that few Europeans had truly understood. These years of mapping and exploration forged in him a profound connection to land and an acute awareness of logistics, terrain, and human resourcefulness. Alone in the wilderness, George learned resilience, decisiveness, and the quiet power of preparation, skills that would echo decades later on distant battlefields. By his late teens, Washington's ambition and discipline intersected with the call of service. The French and Indian War, a conflict that would embroil Britain, France, and Native American nations across North America, became his first stage of military significance. As a young officer in the Virginia militia, he displayed courage, initiative, and an unflinching sense of responsibility. His early campaigns, from scouting missions to skirmishes along the frontier, revealed both his potential and the harsh realities of leadership, the weight of human life, the unpredictability of nature, and the consequences of miscalculation. Washington absorbed every lesson, internalizing victories and defeats alike with the meticulous attention that would define his later command. His reputation began to grow, first among colonial officers, then among British superiors. He was recognized for his discipline, his ability to inspire men, and his personal integrity, qualities that marked him as exceptional in a society where rank and birth often outweighed merit. Yet George remained self-conscious of his limitations, writing often of the need for education, strategy, and moral steadiness. His ambition was tempered by reflection, his confidence built upon experience and observation, not mere bravado. He understood that leadership demanded patience, judgment, and the ability to endure hardship alongside those one commanded. During these formative years, Washington also navigated the complex social networks of Virginia's gentry. Marriage, family connections, and land ownership were more than personal considerations. They were instruments of influence and status. In 1759, he married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow whose intelligence, grace, and social standing complemented his own ambitions. The union secured not only personal companionship, but also economic stability, allowing him to focus on both estate management and the growing demands of military and civic service. Martha became his partner, confidant, and stabilizing presence, helping him navigate the responsibilities of both private life and public duty. Washington's early experiences were inseparable from the evolving political climate of the colonies. He observed the tensions between colonial assemblies and royal governors, between the demands of local self-rule and the authority of distant Britain. These observations shaped his understanding of governance, law, and justice. He was learning, often through trial and correspondence, that leadership required both ethical clarity and strategic pragmatism. A misjudgment could cost lives, indecision could erode cost, action without foresight could imperil not only reputation, but entire communities. By the 1760s, Washington had become a figure of rising prominence. He commanded respect as a military officer, landowner, and participant in colonial politics. Yet he remained conscious of the precarious balance between ambition and duty, between public service and personal survival. Every decision, whether in surveying lands, leading men, or advising local councils, was measured, deliberate, and guided by a growing moral compass. He understood that leadership was not a role granted by birth alone, but one earned through integrity, courage, and foresight. The decade leading to the American Revolution was a period of observation, networking, and quiet preparation. Washington witnessed Britain's increasingly heavy-handed policies, the economic strains of taxation without representation, and the stirrings of colonial discontent. He listened to debates in taverns, courts, and assemblies, absorbing both the grievances and the aspirations of his fellow colonists. In these moments, he began to recognize the contours of a larger struggle, not just a conflict of armies, but a battle for principles, legitimacy, and self-determination. And though he had not yet taken up arms in the cause of independence, he was preparing, in mind and spirit, for the role that destiny would demand. Washington's character was forged at the intersection of personal responsibility, public observation, and the relentless demands of circumstance. The quiet patience learned surveying frontier lands, the courage tested in early skirmishes, and the ethical rigor cultivated in both personal and civic life coalesced into a temperament uniquely suited for the extraordinary challenges ahead. He was neither a prodigy in the conventional sense, nor a man seeking glory for its own sake. Instead, he embodied the disciplined accumulation of experience, the quiet cultivation of judgment, and the steadfast attention to principle, qualities that would define both his command in war and his vision in peace. By the eve of the Revolutionary War, George Washington stood as a man shaped by land, duty, and the relentless observation of human nature. His early years had instilled an unshakable resilience, a measured sense of authority, and a capacity for both empathy and strategic calculation. From the quiet fields of Virginia to the forests of the frontier, from his disciplined household to the smoke of distant battlefields, Washington had learned the essentials of leadership: preparation, courage, integrity, and patience. The stage was set. The colonies were on the brink of revolution, and a man who would learn to balance principle with action, reflection with courage, and humanity with command was about to emerge not just as a participant, but as the defining figure of a nation's birth. The boy who measured forests, charted rivers, and observed the rhythms of life along the Potomac was now ready to lead armies, inspire citizens, and become the embodiment of a revolutionary cause. He was no longer simply George Washington of Virginia. He was the symbol of emerging American identity, the bearer of responsibility for freedom, and the figure whose presence would shape the destiny of a continent. The year was 1775. A continent simmered with tension, and whispers of rebellion had begun to coalesce into open defiance. George Washington, already seasoned in military experience, but still relatively young in the grand arc of history, received a summons that would forever define his life. The Second Continental Congress had appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a daunting charge for a man who had never led a full-scale war and whose resources were, at best, modest. He assumed the role with quiet resolve, fully aware that the future of a people, the credibility of a fledgling government, and the fragile hopes of liberty now rested on his shoulders. Washington's first days as commander were marked by immediate and daunting challenges. His army was a patchwork of militias, volunteers, and inexperienced men, poorly equipped and inadequately trained. Morale was fragile. Hunger, disease, and harsh winter conditions threatened both body and spirit. Supplies were scarce, artillery limited, and the soldiers' loyalty, while committed to the cause, required constant reinforcement. Yet Washington's keen observation and unshakable discipline allowed him to impose structure upon chaos. He drilled his men relentlessly, instilling in them not only the fundamentals of military maneuvers, but the principles of cohesion, courage, and loyalty. He understood that victories were won not just through strategy, but through the cultivation of trust, respect, and shared purpose. The war's early campaigns were as treacherous as the political landscape that surrounded them. At Boston, Washington took command amidst siege and uncertainty, turning raw recruits into a force capable of standing against professional British troops. Through patience, ingenuity, and the careful use of limited resources, he orchestrated maneuvers that tested both enemy resolve and his own strategic foresight. Every decision, from fortifying positions to coordinating logistics, reflected a mind capable of synthesizing complexity into clear, actionable plans. It was here, in the frozen tension of encampments and the quiet calculations of maps, that Washington's hallmark qualities of foresight, restraint, and moral authority first crystallized under fire. Yet leadership during war demanded more than tactical brilliance. Washington faced constant political scrutiny from Congress, local governors, and rival officers. His authority, though formally established, was frequently challenged by jealous subordinates, skeptical politicians, and factions with competing visions of liberty. In private, he kept meticulous journals and correspondence, documenting grievances, strategic assessments, and reflections on human nature. He learned to temper impatience with prudence, to assert authority with moral clarity, and to navigate the intricate web of revolutionary politics without undermining the fragile unity of his army. Leadership, he discovered, was as much about patience and diplomacy as it was about courage on the battlefield. One of Washington's defining qualities emerged in the harsh winters in Valley Forge. Encircled by frost, hunger, and disease, his army faced despair that could have ended the revolution. Yet Washington's presence alone provided hope. He walked among his men, shared in their hardships, and communicated a vision of purpose that transcended immediate suffering. He sought expert instruction, brought in Prussian drill masters, and reorganized his forces to emerge stronger and more disciplined. By the spring of 1778, the Continental Army had been transformed from a disparate group of volunteers into a professional, resilient fighting force. Victory, Washington understood, was built as much in preparation, discipline, and endurance as in combat itself. Washington's strategic patience often set him apart from other commanders. Rather than seek glory in every skirmish, he prioritized long-term sustainability, calculated retreats, and careful alliances. His ability to weigh risk, manage uncertainty, and maintain cohesion among diverse units made him both respected and at times enigmatic to contemporaries. He refused to allow personal ambition to override collective necessity, understanding that the revolution's survival depended on vision, restraint, and moral credibility. These qualities, honed over years of observation, reflection, and early military service, now define the character of America's commander-in-chief. The crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776 became emblematic of Washington's blend of audacity and meticulous planning. Facing overwhelming odds, fatigue, and treacherous conditions, he led his troops in a surprise attack on Hessian forces at Trenton. The victory, small in scale but monumental in effect, revived the morale of an army on the brink of collapse and inspired confidence across the colonies. It was not a reckless gamble. It was the culmination of careful observation, courage, and the precise execution of a strategy adapted to both men and terrain. Washington's men learned to trust his judgment, not blindly, but because he had consistently earned it through calculated decisiveness and unwavering commitment. Victory after victory, crisis after crisis, Washington's leadership became inseparable from his character. At Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth, he balanced audacity with pragmatism, demonstrating both courage in action and wisdom in restraint. He navigated alliances with France, managed internal dissent, and maintained the cohesion of an army constantly stretched by attrition and supply shortages. Every challenge reinforced a principle that would define his legacy. True leadership requires a balance of moral integrity, strategic foresight, empathy, and unshakable commitment to the greater cause. The revolution also tested Washington's understanding of human nature. He faced betrayal, desertion, and the caprice of public opinion. Yet he never wavered in his commitment to principle, earning him loyalty that outlasted immediate circumstances. Officers and soldiers alike came to see in him not merely a military leader, but a moral exemplar, someone whose personal discipline, courage, and humility set the standard for an emerging nation. His leadership, forged in the crucible of war, became a template for authority grounded in respect, trust, and ethical responsibility. By the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, Washington had emerged not only as the general who secured independence, but as the symbol of a new nation. His careful blending of audacity and prudence, moral authority and strategic skill, patience and decisiveness created a framework for leadership that would define American governance and civic virtue for generations. The colonies had been transformed into a republic, but the young nation's survival depended upon more than treaties or victories. It depended on the character, judgment, and restraint of those entrusted with its guidance. Washington's ability to lead through uncertainty, inspire loyalty without coercion, and maintain principle amid adversity marked him as singular in history. The man who had once walked alone through Virginia's forests, mapped the frontier, and observed the rhythms of life along the Potomac now stood at the pinnacle of revolutionary leadership. He was both human and emblematic, a soldier, a strategist, a moral compass, and the living embodiment of the ideals for which a nation had fought. As the war drew to a close with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Washington faced a decision that would test his character in a different way: the choice to relinquish power. In an era when victorious generals often became monarchs or dictators, he returned authority to Congress, resigning his commission with a quiet dignity that astonished the world. The act was revolutionary not only in military terms, but in moral and political precedent. By placing principle above personal ambition, Washington cemented his legacy not just as a general, but as a guardian of Republican values, setting a standard for civic virtue that would echo across centuries. The Continental Army had been transformed. The colonies had become a nation, and George Washington, once a boy of the Virginia frontier, had become the living symbol of courage, integrity, and the disciplined exercise of authority. The stage was set for the next act of his life: the forging of a government, the shaping of a presidency, and the creation of enduring institutions that would define the American experiment. In 1789, the United States of America stood at a precarious juncture. The Constitution had been ratified, promising a framework for governance, yet the reality of leadership in a fledgling nation was fraught with uncertainty. Into this fragile arena stepped George Washington, unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. The weight of expectation was enormous. He was not merely assuming office, he was defining it. Every decision, every gesture, every precedent he set would echo through generations. Washington understood this responsibility with a clarity born of years surveying land, leading men, and navigating crises. He knew that the survival of a republic required more than law. It required example. Washington approached the presidency as both steward and architect. He established the executive branch with care, balancing authority with restraint. He selected capable advisors, creating what became the first cabinet, a group designed to inform, debate, and execute policy while preserving the dignity of the office. His choices reflected prudence, competence, and a subtle understanding of human character. Alexander Hamilton would guide fiscal policy. Thomas Jefferson would oversee foreign affairs. Henry Knox and Edmund Randolph would manage military and legal responsibilities. Washington's ability to balance competing visions, temper ambition, and cultivate collaboration became a hallmark of his leadership. The first challenge was domestic stability. The new nation faced economic disarray, regional tensions, and lingering divisions from the Revolutionary War. Washington, with Hamilton's guidance, enacted policies to consolidate federal authority, manage debt, and stabilize the economy. The creation of a national bank, the assumption of state debts, and careful attention to taxation were not mere financial maneuvers. They were acts of strategic foresight designed to establish credibility, prevent fragmentation, and ensure that the federal government could function with authority and legitimacy. These policies, controversial at the time, demonstrated Washington's commitment to principle over popularity, stability over impulse. Simultaneously, Washington navigated the perilous waters of foreign policy. The nation was young, militarily modest, and economically fragile. He understood that entanglement in European conflicts could imperil everything the colonies had achieved. Yet neutrality required more than decree. It required persuasion, negotiation, and disciplined communication. Through the proclamation of neutrality in 1793 and careful engagement with European powers, Washington reinforced America's sovereignty while avoiding destructive conflicts. He balanced diplomacy and moral clarity, maintaining independence while cultivating respect, a template for a nation finding its place on the world stage.
Washington's domestic leadership extended beyond policy into the realm of symbolism and precedent. He understood that the office of president could define the nation's character. He eschewed monarchical trappings, insisting upon republican simplicity even amid ceremony. He walked the fine line between authority and accessibility, creating a sense of dignity that inspired respect, while maintaining moral humility. The oath of office, the inaugural address, and the careful exercise of executive powers became rituals and frameworks, codifying the expectations, responsibilities, and ethical boundaries of the presidency. Every act, from hosting dignitaries to responding to crises, reflected deliberation, integrity, and foresight. Civil unrest tested his resolve. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, a protest against taxation in western Pennsylvania, challenged both authority and patience. Washington responded decisively but judiciously, leading troops to demonstrate federal power while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. He communicated firmness without cruelty, discipline without vindictiveness. The outcome reinforced the legitimacy of the federal government and established a precedent. Laws would be enforced, dissent respected, but the authority of the Union was paramount. Leadership, Washington demonstrated, was as much about moral example and measured action as it was about enforcement or coercion.
Throughout his presidency, Washington maintained a disciplined focus on national unity. He warned against regionalism, partisan factionalism, and the divisive allure of foreign influence in his farewell address of 1796. The address was not merely counsel, it was a distillation of decades of observation, reflection, and experience. It articulated principles of civic virtue, ethical leadership, and prudent governance. He cautioned that unity, integrity, and vigilance were essential to survival, both for the Republic and for the ideals upon which it had been founded. His words, deliberate and timeless, became a touchstone for generations seeking guidance in turbulent times. Washington's personal life during the presidency was intertwined with public responsibility. Mount Vernon, his home along the Potomac, remained a sanctuary, a place of reflection, correspondence, and domestic management. Martha Washington provided both emotional support and practical counsel, maintaining a household that mirrored the dignity and order of the executive office. The rhythm of family life, correspondence, and routine reinforced his disciplined approach to leadership, observation, reflection, and consistent action. Even amid the pressures of governance, he nurtured a balance that reflected the union he sought to sustain: personal integrity and public responsibility, private repose and civic vigilance. As he prepared to step down after 2 terms, Washington confronted the immense temptation of continued power. Unlike many leaders in history, he chose to relinquish authority voluntarily, establishing the precedent of peaceful transfer and voluntary limitation. In 1797, he returned to Mount Vernon, leaving the office with dignity, restraint, and an unshakable commitment to principle. His decision communicated more than personal humility. It codified the ethical foundation of the Republic, demonstrating that leadership was not entitlement, but stewardship. The precedent he set became a defining feature of American governance, shaping expectations for generations to come. Washington's presidency was transformative not only in policy, but in character and culture. He demonstrated that executive power could be exercised with restraint, integrity, and vision. He blended moral authority with strategic foresight, balancing domestic needs, foreign relations, and public expectations with disciplined judgment. He established rituals, protocols, and conventions that anchored the nation in legitimacy and stability. Through both action and example, he forged a presidency that was not merely an office, but a moral and practical institution, a standard against which all future leaders would be measured. By the end of his presidency, George Washington had become more than a military hero. He was the living embodiment of the principles, discipline, and resilience upon which the United States had been founded. He had navigated crises, balanced ambition with principle, and crafted a government capable of sustaining liberty. From the forests of Virginia to the halls of Congress, from battlefields to Mount Vernon, Washington had demonstrated that leadership was not merely power. It was moral clarity, steadfastness, and the capacity to inspire trust. As he looked out over the Potomac, in the quiet of Mount Vernon, he reflected upon a life that had spanned frontier exploration, revolutionary struggle, and the founding of a nation. Each experience, the surveying of land, the trials of war, and the responsibilities of the presidency, had forged a character defined by patience, courage, and integrity. The republic he had helped create, delicate and unprecedented, owed its survival to both his actions and the example he set. In stepping away from power, he ensured that the legacy of leadership would be measured not by dominion, but by discipline, principle, and the enduring strength of civic virtue. George Washington, once a boy wandering Virginia's forests, had become the father of a nation, a man whose life bridged the personal and the political, the private and the public, the ideal and the practical. The story of his first presidency was not merely one of policy, legislation, or ceremony. It was a story of character, restraint, and the creation of institutions capable of sustaining liberty. It was a story that would echo through centuries, shaping both the nation he helped to found and the enduring ideals for which it stood. When George Washington returned to Mount Vernon in 1797, the nation he had helped forge was still fragile, yet it was standing on principles he had worked tirelessly to instill. Peace replaced the roar of cannons. The hum of governance replaced the urgency of battlefield strategy. For a man whose life had been defined by duty, responsibility, and public service, this transition to private life was both a relief and a new challenge. Retirement was not idleness, for Mount Vernon demanded constant attention, and Washington approached it with the same meticulous discipline he had applied to surveying, military campaigns, and the presidency.
His days began before dawn. He walked the estate's rolling fields, inspected crops, attended to the care of livestock, and oversaw improvements to his lands. The rhythms of agrarian life were familiar yet grounding, a counterbalance to the relentless demands of public office. Washington's practical intelligence extended to all aspects of plantation management, crop rotation, soil preservation, and labor management, all executed with a precision that reflected his innate organizational skill. Even in retirement, he continued to observe, plan, and act with foresight, treating Mount Vernon not merely as a home, but as a laboratory for discipline, stewardship, and responsibility. Martha Washington remained his companion, confidant, and a stabilizing presence. Her intelligence and grace allowed him space to reflect and recharge, while her household management preserved both dignity and order. Together, they maintained a life marked by restraint, propriety, and attention to detail, projecting an image of Republican virtue even in private. Washington's correspondence with political leaders, friends, and family continued, demonstrating that though he had stepped down from office, his influence in council remained sought and respected. He became, in many ways, the nation's moral compass, quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. Yet Washington's retirement was not insulated from the turbulence of public life. He remained deeply aware of the political currents shaping the young republic, partisan divides, foreign intrigues, and the ongoing evolution of governance. He offered guidance when requested, carefully weighing intervention against principle, always cautious not to impose, yet willing to instruct. His letters reflected a profound understanding of human nature and political dynamics, tempered by decades of experience. He advised on everything from military preparedness to constitutional interpretation, demonstrating that leadership could endure without office, that influence grounded in integrity and wisdom could persist even from the quiet of one's estate. Washington also devoted attention to education, innovation, and the improvement of agricultural practices. He experimented with crop diversification, introduced new farming techniques, and engaged in scientific observation of plant and animal life. These pursuits reflected his lifelong curiosity, meticulous observation, and understanding that progress, whether for a nation or a farm, required patience, experimentation, and disciplined reflection. In these quiet labors, he embodied the principles he had practiced throughout life: foresight, responsibility, and the blending of vision with practicality. As the years passed, Washington's health began to decline. The hardships of war, the burdens of leadership, and the weight of responsibility had left their mark on his body. Yet his mind remained sharp, his judgment steady, and his moral clarity intact. In December of 1799, after a brief illness brought on by a severe throat infection, George Washington passed away at Mount Vernon, surrounded by family, cared for by devoted aides, and leaving the world he had helped shape profoundly altered. He was 67 years old, a man whose life had bridged colonial America, revolutionary struggle, and the establishment of a functioning republic. Washington's death was mourned with intensity across the young nation. Bells tolled, newspapers recorded tributes, and citizens gathered to honor a leader who had become more than a figurehead. He was remembered not only for victories in war or accomplishments in governance, but for the enduring principles he embodied: integrity, discipline, courage, restraint, and a steadfast commitment to the collective good. From the streets of New York to the hills of Virginia, his legacy was palpable, a standard against which all subsequent leaders would be measured. The enduring influence of Washington's life extends beyond political or military achievements. He established the precedent of civilian control over the military, demonstrating that authority must always be tempered by principle. He codified the expectation of peaceful transfer of power, showing that leadership is a stewardship, not a personal entitlement. He balanced public responsibility with personal integrity, creating a template for ethical governance. His vision of unity, national identity, and civic virtue became foundational pillars upon which the Republic would continue to build. Washington's image, both in life and posthumously, became emblematic of the ideals he practiced. Portraits captured his dignity, presence, and resolve. Statues immortalized his poise and determination, and stories of his leadership, courage, and foresight became part of the national consciousness. Yet perhaps his greatest legacy lies not in monuments or texts, but in the ethical framework he demonstrated: that leadership demands foresight, moral courage, patience, and the capacity to place the collective above the personal. Even today, George Washington is remembered not merely as the first president of the United States or as the general who secured independence, but as the embodiment of principled leadership. His life illustrates the delicate balance between personal ambition and public duty, between strategic action and moral restraint, between courage and humility. From the quiet fields of Virginia to the battlefields of revolution, From the halls of early governance to the serenity of Mount Vernon, Washington's journey reflects the shaping of both a nation and a character whose resonance transcends centuries. The story of George Washington is not merely a tale of historical events. It is a meditation on the nature of leadership, the demands of responsibility, and the enduring power of integrity. It reminds us that greatness is forged in observation, preparation, and the careful exercise of judgment. That courage is as much about perseverance as it is about action. That authority is most enduring when tempered by principle. He was, in every sense, the father of a nation, not because he sought glory, but because he cultivated discipline, wisdom, and steadfast virtue. As the sun set over the Potomac, casting long shadows across the fields of Mount Vernon, George Washington's life came full circle. The boy who had wandered Virginia's forests, measured its rivers, and observed its people had become a man whose life and example would endure far beyond his years. He had commanded armies, guided a fledgling nation, and established principles that would outlast generations. In his death as in his life, he offered a lesson to the world, that leadership is not a reward, but a responsibility, that service is its own measure of greatness, and that the legacy of integrity and wisdom is the most enduring monument any individual can leave. George Washington, the man, the soldier, the president, and the moral exemplar, had departed, but the nation he helped create carried forward in his stead. His legacy became inseparable from the American identity, a testament to courage, foresight, and the enduring power of principled leadership.